My name is Tori Young. I am 52 years old, and exactly 3 weeks ago, my 78-year-old father called me in hysterics. It was the very first time in my entire existence I had ever heard the man shed a tear. He was absolutely begging me to rush over and save them, leaning heavily on the phrase, "Family helps family." You see, for 3 long decades, I functioned as the invisible child. I was the daughter who apparently wasn't worth the price of a college tuition. I was the one who stood quietly in the shadows while my older sister, Victoria, was showered with everything imaginable: a massive down payment for a house, a brand new luxury vehicle, a fairy tale wedding, and a seemingly bottomless well of emergency cash. My parents proudly referred to Victoria as their ultimate success story. They just referred to me as Tori. But when the devastating day finally arrived, when the doctors explicitly stated that both of my parents required full-time, round-the-clock care and could no longer safely live independently, they didn't dial their golden child's number. They dialed mine. I asked my father one simple question on that phone call: "Have you tried reaching out to your successful daughter?" The dead silence on the line lasted for exactly 47 seconds. What I ultimately uncovered during those agonizing 47 seconds, and the absolute explosion that occurred at the family hospital meeting shortly after, completely shattered everything I believed about my blood relatives, my sister, and my own self-worth. Before we dive into exactly what went down in that conference room, if you have ever felt like a ghost haunting your own family tree, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. But only do so if this journey genuinely strikes a chord with you. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from today and what time it is on your clock. Now, let's rewind the tape to where this toxic dynamic truly took root. The summer of 1989 was supposed to be a thrilling season for our household. I was 15, Victoria had just turned 18, and our home was vibrating with chaotic energy as she prepared to leave for her freshman year of college. My parents didn't just host a small family dinner, they threw an extravagant send-off gala. They invited 40 guests, hired professional catering, and hung a massive, custom-printed banner across the living room that boldly proclaimed, "Congratulations, Victoria, future business leader." I spent that entire magical evening balancing heavy trays of hors d'oeuvres, topping off empty wine glasses, and bussing dirty plates. Bright and early that morning, my mother had literally shoved a catering apron into my chest and instructed, "Try to make yourself useful today, honey. This is your sister's shining moment." I wasn't permitted a seat at the main dining table. I scarfed down my dinner standing up in the kitchen between serving rounds. Toward the end of the night, my father stood up and delivered a tear-jerking toast. His voice swelled with overwhelming pride as he publicly revealed they were handing Victoria a $40,000 check to cover her entire 4-year university tuition. The crowd erupted into applause. Victoria dramatically wiped away tears of joy. My mother beamed like she had just won the lottery. Absolutely nobody looked in my direction. Hours later, once the final guest had departed and I was scrubbing the last of the serving platters, I wandered into my father's home office. "Dad," I asked quietly, "what about my college savings?" He didn't even lift his eyes from his desk paperwork. "We will cross that bridge when we come to it, Tori. Higher education isn't for everybody. You've always been much more practical." Exactly 3 years later, when it was time for me to apply to nursing school, I brought the topic up again. "Oh, sweetie, we already drained your college fund for your sister's expenses," my mother informed me with a gentle, patronizing pat on the hand. "But let's be honest, a nursing program is vastly cheaper anyway. You're smart, you'll figure a way to make it work." And I did figure it out. For 3 grueling years, I balanced 2 brutal jobs. I waitressed late-night diner shifts and filed paperwork at a local medical clinic during the day, entirely funding my own path through nursing school. Meanwhile, Victoria strolled across her graduation stage completely debt-free, clutching a business degree, and immediately received the keys to a brand new car my parents purchased as her graduation present. At the time, I was completely oblivious to the fact that the phrase, "We already spent your college fund," was merely the prologue to a deeply entrenched pattern that would dictate the next 30 years of our lives. Let's fast forward to June of 1998. Victoria was marrying Robert Ashford, a hotshot junior attorney equipped with an aggressive handshake and an overly polished grin. Victoria proudly declared him her golden ticket to the lavish lifestyle she was always destined for. My parents gleefully dropped $85,000 on that wedding reception. I know the exact dollar amount because my mother made a point to boast about it to anyone who would listen, always radiating pride, never showing an ounce of financial regret. A mother's daughter only walks down the aisle once, she would constantly justify. We simply must ensure everything is flawless. I was designated as a bridesmaid. I was forced to pull $400 out of my own pocket for an ugly taffeta dress I would absolutely never wear again. When I tentatively asked if my parents might help cover the bridal party fees, Victoria just giggled at me. "Tori, it's really not that expensive. Just throw it on a credit card like a normal person." 3 years later, my boyfriend Marcus asked me to marry him. Marcus was a union electrician. He had incredibly steady employment, rough, calloused hands, and the kindest eyes I had ever seen. When we announced our engagement, my parents slid a paper check across the dining table. It was for $2,000. "You completely understand, right?" my father stated, tapping the check. Marcus strikes me as a highly practical guy. He isn't going to want some massive, flashy affair. Practical. There was that agonizing word again. My mother didn't even bother to attend my bridal dress fitting. She claimed she was entirely too swamped that afternoon helping Victoria unbox kitchen appliances at her brand new house, a house my parents had just happily contributed a $50,000 down payment toward. "It is a crucial investment in your sister's future," my father casually defended when I questioned why a successful attorney like Robert needed my parents' money to buy real estate. "They are just trying to build their foundation." That massive, beautiful house was located exactly 3 blocks away from the cramped, one-bedroom apartment Marcus and I were currently renting. My wedding was incredibly tiny. We had 60 people, a simple backyard exchange of vows, and a potluck-style dinner reception. Throughout the evening, I watched my father twirl Victoria around the makeshift dance floor, while my mother hovered nearby, constantly checking if Victoria's designer heels were pinching her toes. I continually lied to myself that night. I told myself it was perfectly fine. I told myself I didn't actually want their financial handouts. But what I genuinely craved, what my soul was starving for, was for them to simply look at me and acknowledge my existence. I wouldn't fully comprehend just how utterly blind they were until my phone rang 23 years later. The glowing numbers on my nightstand clock read 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the precise minute because I lay there in the dark, staring at my vibrating phone screen for 3 agonizing seconds before picking it up. My father's contact name was illuminating the dark room. He hadn't bothered to call me in over 6 months. "Dad." The horrible noise that erupted through the phone speaker practically stopped the blood in my veins. My father was wailing. It wasn't just a quiet cry. He was violently sobbing and hyperventilating. It was a terrifying, shattered sound I had never witnessed him produce in my 52 years on Earth. "Tori, it's your mother," he choked out. She collapsed in the master bathroom. I heard a horrible crash and his voice completely fractured. "I cannot physically lift her up. I don't know what to do. Tori, there is blood everywhere." I was already throwing the bedsheets off and shoving my legs into a pair of sweatpants. "Dad, listen to my voice. Dial 911 immediately. I am pulling out of my driveway right now." Under normal traffic conditions, the local hospital was a 20-minute drive. I got there in 12. By the time I sprinted through the sliding emergency doors, my mother had already been rushed into an operating theater. She had sustained a severely fractured hip, the brutal kind of break that permanently alters the trajectory of an elderly person's life. I found my father completely collapsed into a hard plastic waiting room chair. He looked so incredibly frail, like he had shrunk in size. A physician in scrubs walked over to us. His ID badge read Dr. Morrison. "Mr. Young? Your wife's surgical procedure is going to take several more hours, but we urgently need to discuss the road ahead." Dr. Morrison outlined the grim reality with professional caution. My mother was going to require intense, grueling physical rehabilitation for an absolute minimum of 3 months. Then, he gently turned his attention to my father. He noted that during the emergency intake process, my dad had exhibited highly alarming symptoms: severe disorientation, acute confusion, and unmistakable early-stage markers of cognitive decline. They can no longer safely reside in an independent living situation, Dr. Morrison stated firmly. You are going to have to make immediate arrangements for full-time, round-the-clock care. My father looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute panic. I had dedicated the last 15 years of my career as a specialized geriatric care nurse. I knew intimately what full-time care entailed. I knew the waiting lists for the facilities, the crushing monthly invoices, and the agonizing, rapid depletion of life savings that accompanied the aging process. What I did not know in that waiting room was exactly whose shoulders my family expected to carry that massive burden. The following afternoon, I walked into my mother's recovery room. My father was perched on a stool beside her bed. She was still heavily sedated from the anesthesia, drifting aimlessly between sleep and wakefulness. My dad looked like he had aged a full decade since the previous night. Tori, he motioned toward an empty chair. We desperately need to discuss the game plan. I sat down. I waited. Your mother and I, we are going to require a lot of help. Real, substantial help. He aggressively dragged both hands down his exhausted face. We need somebody physically present to organize the daily medications, to manage the house, to ensure we don't hurt ourselves. I completely understand the medical requirements, Dad. You are a licensed nurse. This is exactly what you do for a living. He stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Family helps family, Tori. Those heavy words just hung suspended in the sterile hospital air. Have you picked up the phone and called Victoria yet? I asked. Absolute silence. 1 second passed. Then 5. Then 10. Exactly 47 seconds. I counted every single one of them in my head. Your older sister is incredibly busy right now, he finally muttered, looking down at the linoleum floor. She is dealing with her own set of problems. What problems? He completely dodged the question. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably on his stool and uttered a sentence that sliced deeper than the agonizing silence. You have always been our reliable child, Tori. You are the one who just puts her head down and never complains. Victoria, she is. He swallowed hard. She is much more fragile. She simply wouldn't be able to handle this kind of stress. Fragile. The woman who threw a screaming fit over the floral arrangements at an $85,000 wedding was fragile. The woman who happily accepted a $50,000 real estate handout was fragile. But me? I was just reliable. My mind raced back to the grueling double shifts during nursing school, the hideous $400 bridesmaid dress, the 3 decades of watching my family operate from the nosebleed section. Dad, what specifically are you demanding from me right now? He rattled off his expectations without missing a beat. I was to personally coordinate their transition, strictly manage their pharmaceutical routines, hold the medical power of attorney, visit the house constantly, and remain permanently on call. And Victoria, he added quickly, she will absolutely pitch in whenever she has free time. In 30 long years, that was the very first time my father had ever labeled me reliable. But hearing it out loud didn't feel like a badge of honor. It felt like a dark confession. It was a blatant admission that they had always known exactly who possessed the strength to save them. They just never believed I was worth pouring their resources into. Later that evening, I sat at my own kitchen island with Marcus. The house was dead quiet, save for the low hum of our refrigerator and the crushing weight of decades of unspoken resentment. What exactly did Victoria have to say about all this? Marcus asked, leaning against the counter. Dad didn't even bother to call her. Marcus slowly placed his ceramic coffee mug down. He didn't look remotely shocked. Why would he be? I grabbed a legal pad and began aggressively scribbling down financial figures. It is my ultimate coping mechanism, reducing massive emotional chaos down to cold, hard calculations. Committing to full-time caregiving meant I would have to either resign from my clinic entirely or violently slash my hours. That equated to a $65,000 annual loss in household income. Hiring professional, in-home nursing staff ran anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 every single month. Shifting them to a high-quality assisted living facility wasn't going to be much cheaper. What is the status of their life savings? Marcus asked gently. Maybe enough to keep them afloat for 18 months? 2 years maximum if we squeeze every penny. And if Victoria refuses to contribute? I didn't utter a response. I didn't have to. Marcus walked over, reaching across the island to grasp my hand. His palms were rough and scarred from decades of pulling electrical wire, but his touch was incredibly grounding. You have spent your entire life saying yes to people who look right through you, he murmured softly. I think it is finally time you start asking them why. I thought about every single yes I had surrendered over the last 30 years. Saying yes to navigating nursing school in total isolation. Saying yes to throwing a cheap potluck wedding because we were supposedly practical. Saying yes to being entirely ignored at every Christmas, every birthday, and every family milestone where Victoria was pushed into the glowing spotlight. What happens if I just say yes to them one more time? I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. What if I just swallow it and do exactly what they expect? Then absolutely nothing changes. Marcus squeezed my fingers. You will slowly erase a little more of yourself every single day, and they will never even notice you are fading away. He didn't demand that I fight back. He never told me what to do. He just held my hand in the quiet kitchen and said, whatever path you choose, I am right beside you. But you deserve to be treated as vastly more than their emergency backup plan. The very next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 decades. I personally dialed Victoria's cell phone. She finally picked up on the 6th ring. Her voice was incredibly groggy, heavily thick with sleep, despite the fact that it was 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. Hello. Victoria, it's Tori. A long, dramatic yawn echoed through the speaker. What time is it? It's 9 o'clock. Mom took a severe fall. She is currently admitted to the hospital. What? Suddenly, the sleepiness vanished. When exactly did this happen? 2 days ago. 2 days. Why on earth didn't anybody call me? Dad explicitly told me you were far too busy. A heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. I could hear the rustling of expensive bed sheets. Maybe a bedroom door clicking shut. I am incredibly busy, Tori. I have a lot of major things going on right now. Mom requires emergency hip surgery. Dad is actively exhibiting signs of dementia. They urgently need full-time, structured care. Okay, so what exactly do you want me to do about it? That specific question hit my chest like a bucket of ice water. I want you to help share the massive responsibility. She let out a long, deeply put-upon sigh. Tori, you know I am absolutely terrible at dealing with that kind of depressing stuff. What stuff? Taking care of ailing parents. The tedious medical logistics, the endless organizing. That is entirely your world, Tori. It does not have to be exclusively my world, Victoria. Look. Her tone instantly grew defensive and hard. You are the licensed nurse here. This is literally your professional job. You naturally know how to handle old people. Old people. They are our parents. Victoria, they don't just need medical expertise, they need massive financial support. Care facilities cost thousands of dollars a month. Well, I don't have any spare cash right now. You have a massive house. The exact house Mom and Dad put $50,000 down on. Dead silence on the line. Victoria, I don't own that property anymore. I felt the kitchen floor physically tilt beneath my feet. The beautiful home my parents had sacrificed $50,000 of their hard-earned money to secure was just gone. What on earth do you mean? I was forced to sell it 3 years ago after the divorce got finalized. And the massive equity from the sale? That is absolutely none of your business. In my entire 15-year career as a medical professional, nobody had ever managed to make my life's work feel so incredibly small. But it wasn't her flippant dismissal of my career that gutted me. It was the absolute, unshakable entitlement in her voice. The total certainty that this disaster was exclusively my mess to clean up. Victoria, you're going to need to explain this situation to me right now. Explain what? I am not explaining my private finances to my little sister. If you are claiming you cannot financially contribute a single dime to keep our parents alive, I need to understand exactly why. Another massive, theatrical sigh. I heard a muffled male voice in the background. She quickly covered the receiver, muttered something to the man, and came back on the line. Fine. You want the brutal truth? I am financially drowning. Okay. Drowning in what way? Maxed out credit cards. Astronomical living expenses. Robert legally cleaned me out during the divorce proceedings. I had to liquidate the house just to keep my head above water. Exactly how much debt are we talking about? She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. $89,000. My knees gave out. I sank heavily into one of the kitchen chairs. $89,000. Do not sit there and judge me, Tori. I am not judging you. I am desperately trying to comprehend the math. No, you are doing exactly what you always do. Sitting up on your high horse, looking down at me from your perfectly safe, perfectly boring little life. Looking down at her, the accusation was so absurd it barely computed in my brain. I had spent my entire 30 years on this planet looking up at Victoria. She was the glowing success, the golden child, the only daughter worth a financial investment. My perfect little life? I asked, forcing my voice to remain frighteningly steady. I worked 2 back-breaking jobs simultaneously just to afford my nursing textbooks. Yeah, but you never had to live up to a single expectation. Because Mom and Dad never expected you to achieve anything. Exactly, she practically yelled, sounding bizarrely triumphant. 0 expectations means 0 disappointments. You got to just coast by and be Tori. I had the crushing weight of being everything to them. Victoria, our mother, is currently lying in a sterile hospital bed with a shattered hip. And you will handle it. You always handle the messy stuff. That is completely unfair. Fair. She laughed again, but this time, the sound violently cracked at the edges. Since when has a single thing in this family ever been based on fairness? For one fleeting, microscopic second, I heard something genuine lurking beneath her aggressive defensiveness. It sounded suspiciously like raw pain. But before I could formulate a response, she immediately went back on the attack. I will try my best to visit the hospital whenever my schedule clears up, but do not expect me to move back into my childhood bedroom, and absolutely do not expect me to write checks that will immediately bounce. The line went dead. I just stared at my phone screen. Looking down on her, her words kept echoing in my skull, and a profound realization washed over me. Victoria wasn't actually the successful daughter. Victoria was simply the daughter who had been meticulously trained on how to fail without ever facing a single consequence. I hit redial. She ignored the first call. She ignored the second. On my 3rd consecutive attempt, she finally picked up with an exaggerated, exhausted groan. What the hell do you want now, Tori? We were not finished speaking. I am pretty sure we were. No. You had the audacity to claim I looked down on you. I need to fully unpack that. I seriously do not have the time to play amateur therapy with my little sister. Victoria, for 30 years, you were handed the keys to the kingdom. You got the tuition money, the constant praise, the luxury real estate, the car, the fairy tale wedding. And somehow, your brain has miraculously convinced you that I was the one who had it easy. You did. Her voice was completely flat. Absolute certainty. You married Marcus. You have a simple, blue-collar job. A simple, invisible life. Nobody was constantly monitoring you. Nobody was demanding that you be extraordinary. I fully expected myself to be extraordinary. I shot back. I just didn't require an audience clapping for me while I did it. Wow. That is incredibly easy for you to preach when you are comfortably paying your own tiny mortgage. When you actually have a retirement nest egg. When you aren't drowning in $89,000 of soul-crushing debt. Silence fell over the line. That was incredibly cruel, Tori, she whispered. It wasn't cruel. It was the objective truth. More heavy silence. I could hear her breathing on the other end, ragged, uneven, panicked. What do you want from me? She finally asked, her voice cracking. Do you want me to literally beg for your forgiveness? For happily taking the money they freely offered me? For simply being the child they actually wanted to invest their lives into? I want you to act like an adult and show up for once in your entire life. I want you to take an ounce of responsibility. I cannot magically fix this disaster, Tori. I am not demanding that you fix it. I am just demanding that you help me carry it. It's the exact same thing. No, it is not. She remained quiet for a very long moment. When she finally spoke again, her voice had shrunk, sounding almost like a frightened teenager. I honestly do not know how to be the person that everyone desperately needs me to be right now, Tori. Then you need to learn. Because the rest of us already had to. I didn't wait for her to reply. This time, I was the one who ended the call. I sat alone in my kitchen, my phone resting in my lap, and I made an ironclad decision. I was absolutely going to help my parents navigate this crisis, but I was going to do it entirely on my own terms. What Victoria didn't realize, and what none of my family members knew yet, was that her catastrophic financial ruin wasn't the only buried truth that was about to be dragged into the light. The very next morning, I drove over to my parents' empty house to pack an overnight bag for the hospital. I needed to grab clean clothes for my father, my mother's prescription reading glasses, and their massive binder of medical insurance paperwork. The house smelled heavily of stale dust and old, burnt coffee. Unwashed plates were piled high in the kitchen sink. Stacks of unopened mail littered the entryway floor. Without my mother's obsessive daily routines keeping it together, the entire structure of their lives had already begun to rot. I eventually located the insurance files inside my father's home office, stuffed into a battered metal filing cabinet he had owned since I was a toddler. But as my fingers rifled through the manila folders, they brushed against something distinctly different. It was a thick notebook. It had a worn, genuine leather cover. Written in my mother's unmistakable, looping cursive on the very first page were the words, "Family Records." I knew deep down I shouldn't have opened it. It felt like crossing a sacred boundary. But an overwhelming intuition forced my hand to flip to the very first logged page. It was columns of dates, names, and precise dollar amounts. My mother had been keeping a hyper-meticulous, running financial ledger since 1985. Victoria, college tuition, $40, 000. Victoria, graduation car, $12, 000. Victoria, wedding expenses, $85, 000. Victoria, house down payment, $50, 000. The list stretched on, page after agonizing page. Lavish birthday gifts, emergency, cash infusions that were never reimbursed, a fully funded summer backpacking trip through Europe, a completely new designer wardrobe for a corporate job interview, cosmetic dental work, minimum credit card payments. I frantically flipped toward the back, hunting for my own dedicated section. Tori, wedding gift, $2, 000. Tori, baby shower contribution, $300. Tori, kitchen appliances, Christmas 1998, $400. For densely packed pages outlining Victoria's empire. Exactly half of one page dedicated to me. I stood there doing the mental math in my head, then aggressively double-checked it on my phone's calculator. I prayed the final numbers were an exaggeration, but the ink didn't lie. The absolute final entry in the book was dated exactly 3 months ago. It was written in my mother's increasingly shaky, elderly handwriting, * Victoria called sobbing. Needs $15,000. Massive emergency. Harold firmly says no more. I do not know what to do, *. $15,000 more. Even after absolutely everything else. I pulled out my smartphone and systematically photographed every single page of that ledger. My hands were physically trembling, but my mind had never felt sharper. My mother had been obsessively tracking every single red cent for 4 decades. She possessed total, comprehensive knowledge of exactly what they had surrendered and to whom. The only lingering mystery was whether she had ever allowed her own brain to process what those staggering numbers actually represented. I dug deeper into the filing cabinet. Tucked directly behind the insurance folder, I unearthed their current financial statements, checking accounts, savings ledgers, retirement portfolios. I was looking directly at the entire financial architecture of my parents' twilight years. What I saw made my blood run cold. Their primary savings account sat at $127,000. To the average person, that sounds like a comfortable safety net. To a geriatric nurse who knows what round-the-clock memory care actually costs, it was a terrifyingly shallow puddle. I kept pulling out bank statements. I analyzed the withdrawal history stretching back over a full decade. Every couple of months, another massive chunk of cash had magically vanished. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, 20,000 disappearing in one devastating, inexplicable swoop. The pattern was undeniable. Over the course of the past 10 years, my parents had actively drained more than $200,000 in cash from their own retirement stability. Almost every single dollar of it had been funneled directly to Victoria. Cash to fund her messy divorce, cash to help her start fresh, cash that was now currently buried underneath a mountain of $89,000 in credit card debt. Their life insurance policies were frighteningly minimal. Their long-term care insurance was practically non-existent. Standard Medicare was going to cover the immediate hospital bills, but it would not cover long-term assisted living, nor would it cover professional in-home nursing. I immediately speed-dialed Diane Reeves. She was a trusted former colleague of mine who currently directed a high-end memory care facility downtown. She had been entrenched in the geriatric care industry even longer than I had. "What does their financial runway look like?" Diane asked softly after I dumped the entire nightmare onto her. "Maybe $130,000 total in liquid cash." She fell silent for a long, heavy moment. Tori, with their specific level of physical and cognitive needs, that money buys them maybe 18 months in a reputable, safe facility. 2 years maximum if you stretch every penny until it screams. Once that money evaporates, you are staring down the barrel of brutal Medicaid applications and asset spend-downs. It gets incredibly ugly incredibly fast. What about supplementary family contributions? That obviously extends the timeline. But Tori. She paused, her voice taking on a deeply serious tone. The hospital administration is absolutely going to mandate a formal family meeting before they authorize a discharge. It is standard operating procedure for severe dual care cases like this. A family meeting. A sterile conference room where absolutely everything, their rapidly draining finances, their lack of a safety net, their demanding expectations, would be forced onto the table in front of everybody. "Tori," Diane warned gently, "this meeting is going to turn into a bloodbath. You need to make sure you protect your own peace." I thanked her for the reality check and hung up. I stood alone in my parents' dusty home office, physically surrounded by 40 years of documented, profoundly unequal love written in my own mother's cursive, and I began to formulate a battle plan. That evening, I cleared off our kitchen island and spread the evidence out like a detective's corkboard. Bank statements, the printed photos of the leather notebook, my frantic calculations. Marcus stood over the island, analyzing the paperwork in total silence. "What exactly are you planning to do with all of this?" he finally asked, his brow furrowed. "I have no idea yet. But I refuse to walk into that hospital conference room blind anymore." Marcus reached down and picked up the photograph of Victoria's final tally page. "This equates to $342,000 over 40 years. He gently placed the photo back onto the granite. "And your total?" $7,400. Neither of us uttered another word. The mathematics did all the talking. I spent the next solid hour scanning the most explosive pages into a secure digital backup file. Then, I picked up the phone and dialed Thomas Bradley, a highly respected elder care attorney whom Marcus knew from a commercial job site years ago. Formal family meetings at the hospital are standard protocol, Thomas confirmed over the line. They are designed to explicitly clarify physical and financial responsibilities before the patients are officially discharged. Nothing you verbally commit to in that room is legally binding. Can the hospital legally compel Victoria to contribute financially? I asked. Legally? Absolutely not. Adult children are not legally required to bankroll their parents' medical care unless they have signed very specific guarantor documents. But socially and morally. He paused. That is an entirely different battlefield. What exactly does that mean? Hospital staff rigorously document these family conferences. The assigned social workers take highly detailed clinical notes. If a specific family member makes grand promises in that room and subsequently abandons them, that goes permanently onto the family's medical record. It can severely impact how future care facilities view your family's reliability, and it dictates how long-term payment plans get structured. So, yes, the meeting matters. It matters profoundly. I thanked Thomas for his expertise and ended the call. The hospital meeting was officially locked in for Thursday morning, exactly 4 days away. I had one final task to execute. I dialed Victoria's number. It rang 5 times before dumping me into her voicemail box. I waited for the beep, ensuring my voice was devoid of any emotion. Victoria. The hospital is holding a mandatory family care meeting this Thursday at 10 a.m. You absolutely must be in attendance, even if you have to patch in via video call. I let a brief silence hang on the recording. Do not force me to explain to you why you need to be there. I wasn't meticulously plotting a revenge tour. I wasn't craving a dramatic, screaming confrontation. I was simply planning for absolute clarity. After 30 years of living in a funhouse mirror, I just wanted every single person in my family to be forced to stare at the objective truth. Now, before I reveal exactly what detonated at that hospital meeting, I am incredibly curious about your perspective. If you were standing in my shoes, holding that leather notebook, would you have publicly shared the financial ledger with the family, or would you have kept the secret buried? Please type share or silent down in the comments section. I truly want to know how you would handle it. And if you are still engaged with this story, please give this video a quick thumbs up. It really helps push these stories to people who might need to hear them. Okay, let's get back to the chaos. Thursday morning arrived. 10 a.m. sharp. We filed into the hospital's designated family conference center. The aesthetic of the room was aggressively, depressingly neutral. Drab beige walls, buzzing fluorescent ceiling lights, a massive, forward rectangular table surrounded by stiff chairs, and a gigantic flat-screen television mounted to the far wall for remote participants. It was the exact type of sterile environment where life-altering, agonizing decisions are made under terrible lighting. Marcus sat directly to my right, his large hand resting firmly on the table inches from mine. He had explicitly taken the entire day off from his contracting job without me even asking him to. My father arrived a moment later, slowly pushing my mother into the room in a bulky hospital wheelchair. She looked incredibly tiny and fragile, drowning in her patterned hospital gown, but her eyes were darting around the room, vastly more alert than they had been in days. Dr. Morrison swept into the room clutching a thick manila folder crammed with medical charts. Trailing right behind him was Rachel Smith, the hospital's appointed senior social worker. She was an incredibly composed woman in her mid-40s, armed with a warm smile and a heavy clipboard. "We are just waiting on one final connection," Rachel announced, glancing up at the blank television screen. The monitor suddenly flickered to life. Victoria materialized on the screen, her makeup applied to absolute perfection. She was sitting in what appeared to be a highly curated, elegant living room featuring cream-colored accent walls and a fresh vase of expensive hydrangeas resting on a side table. Her brand-new husband, Brandon, was hovering awkwardly in the background of the frame. "Can everyone hear me clearly?" Victoria projected, obsessively adjusting her webcam angle to catch her good side. "We hear you loud and clear," Rachel confirmed. 2 additional video boxes popped up on the screen. It was my Aunt Linda, my father's younger sister, and Aunt Margaret, my mother's sister. Both women were in their late 70s, dialing in from their respective homes on opposite coasts. "Thank you all so much for gathering today," Rachel initiated, taking her seat at the head of the table. "The primary objective of this conference is to collaboratively develop a sustainable, safe discharge plan for Mr. and Mrs. Young." Dr. Morrison efficiently laid out the brutal medical reality. He detailed the specifics of my mother's shattered hip, the agonizing physical rehabilitation timeline required, and the deeply concerning results of my father's cognitive memory assessments. The bottom line is that they can absolutely no longer safely exist in an independent living environment, Dr. Morrison stated firmly, closing his file. They are going to require consistent, daily, structured support. The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. Up on the television screen, I watched Victoria nervously check her cell phone notifications twice. Rachel slowly turned her chair to survey the room. "We need to collectively decide, as a unified family unit, who is going to be responsible for what moving forward, both practically and financially." The atmospheric pressure in the room instantly shifted. I felt Marcus's pinky finger brush against mine. The battle was officially beginning. Rachel looked around the table, then specifically up at the screen. Let's kick this off by hearing from everyone. What specific resources and time commitments can each family member reasonably contribute to this care plan? Victoria lunged at the microphone before anyone else could even draw a breath. I just want to be incredibly transparent with everyone here, she announced, leaning forward into her webcam with a highly practiced, deeply earnest expression. Brandon and I are currently navigating a horrific financial crisis. We just got married 6 months ago, and I am still desperately trying to rebuild my entire life from the ashes of my divorce. Aunt Linda immediately nodded with deep sympathy through her webcam. We completely understand your situation, sweetheart. Those tragic things take so much time to heal from. It has just been incredibly difficult. Victoria continued her performance, her voice dripping with fake sorrow. Starting over from absolute scratch at my age. I desperately wish I had the means to do more, but... Rachel gracefully turned her attention toward me. And what about you, Mrs. Young? Before I could even open my mouth, Victoria loudly interrupted the feed. Oh, Tori can easily handle the heavy lifting. She declared it with absolute certainty, like it had already been legally mandated. She is a registered nurse. She is totally accustomed to dealing with this specific kind of grim reality. I felt my father actively nodding his head in agreement right beside me. That is entirely correct. Tori has a vast amount of professional experience with. Plus, Victoria rapidly added, cutting our father off, Tori doesn't suffer from the exact same crushing lifestyle pressures that I do. Her daily routine is vastly more manageable than mine. My mother's eyes briefly darted toward my face, panicked, and then immediately stared back down at her lap. Aunt Margaret loudly cleared her throat through the TV speakers. Well, it certainly does make a lot of logical sense when you break it down like that. Tori does possess the actual medical skills. Exactly. Victoria chimed in, practically glowing. I mean, I would absolutely love to jump in and help. I really, truly would. But you all know how clumsy I am with these things. She let out a charming, self-deprecating little giggle. I would probably just end up making the situation 1,000 times worse. Tori has always been so incredibly talented at handling the unglamorous stuff. The unglamorous stuff. 3 decades of being treated like a ghost, completely boiled down to 4 deeply insulting words. I slowly turned to look at my mother. Her wrinkled hands were tightly clasped together in her hospital lap. She violently refused to make eye contact with me. She was absolutely not going to defend me in front of the family. She never had before, and she wasn't about to start now. Marcus firmly pressed his knee against my leg underneath the conference table. It was a silent, grounding question. Are you ready? I pulled in a deep, stabilizing breath. Before we officially dictate who is required to sacrifice what moving forward, I stated, ensuring my voice was low and perfectly level, can we please take a moment to discuss what has already been given? The entire conference room went dead still. Victoria's charming smile instantly vanished from the monitor. What exactly do you mean by that? I mean, I replied, staring directly at the webcam, that Dad has been astronomically generous with his finances toward you over the decades, Victoria. We are talking about the $50,000 house down payment, the brand new car, the luxury wedding, the endless cycle of emergency cash bailouts. My father aggressively shifted his weight in his chair. Tori, that history is entirely irrelevant to the current medical discussion. It is 100% relevant, Dad. You are sitting here actively demanding that I assume the absolute majority of your physical and financial care. Victoria is openly declaring to the social worker that she cannot afford to contribute a single dime, but absolutely nobody in this room is discussing why she can't afford it. Up on the television screen, Victoria's face contorted into pure, defensive rage. Are you seriously trying to bring up ancient financial history right now? Mom literally just had her hip bolted back together. I am not maliciously bringing up money, Victoria. I am bringing up fundamental fairness. Fairness. She let out a sharp, brittle laugh. You seriously want to debate what is fair? I am the child who had to shoulder the agonizing burden of all their massive expectations. I had the pressure. You got to live your entire life completely under the radar. Under the radar. I let that disgusting phrase hang in the sterile hospital air for a moment. Is that what you call it? Is under the radar what you call working 2 consecutive minimum wage jobs just to avoid drowning in nursing school debt? Is that what you call paying my own way through every single milestone of my adult life? Aunt Linda shifted uncomfortably on her video feed. Girls, maybe we should all just take a deep breath and calm down. I completely ignored her, turning my body to face the massive screen head-on. Victoria, where exactly is the house? The beautiful property Mom and Dad handed you $50,000 to secure. Absolute, suffocating silence. You sold the property, I stated. Exactly 3 years ago. That is absolutely none of your damn business. Her voice was shrill and rising in panic. It officially became my business the exact second you looked at a social worker and declared you were too broke to help keep our parents alive. Rachel Smith slowly lowered her clipboard. She looked back and forth between me and the screaming television screen and then turned to my parents. I think it is incredibly vital for the success of this care plan that everyone in this room understands the full, unedited financial picture. My mother's knuckles were turning white in her lap. My father aggressively stared a hole into the fake wood table. And up on the monitor, a terrifying new emotion flickered across Victoria's perfectly contoured face. It wasn't lingering guilt. It wasn't embarrassment. It was pure, primal fear. I calmly reached down into my tote bag. There is a specific document I believe everyone involved in this process needs to review. I pulled out a thick, black folder and slammed it down onto the center of the table. I discovered this hidden in the house yesterday, I announced, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. I found it while I was digging for Mom's Medicare paperwork. My mother's head violently snapped up. For the very first time since she was wheeled into the room, she looked directly into my eyes. This is written entirely in Mom's handwriting. I flipped the black folder open, exposing the stack of high-quality photocopies. She has been maintaining a highly meticulous, penny-for-penny ledger of every single financial gift distributed to her children since 1985. I slid the top copy directly across the table to Rachel Smith. The social worker's eyebrows shot up to her hairline as her eyes rapidly scanned the columns of numbers. What exactly is that? Victoria shrieked from the TV screen. What the hell are you showing the doctors, Tori? I cleared my throat and began reading the numbers aloud. My voice didn't shake. I had practiced this exact delivery in my head 100 times. Victoria, college tuition, $40,000. Graduation vehicle, $12,000. Wedding expenses, $85,000. House down payment, $50,000. Between the years of 1989 and last spring, various unaccounted-for emergency cash loans totaling exactly $155,000. The massive figures echoed through the tiny conference room like bombs detonating in slow motion. In grand total, I concluded, staring directly into the webcam lens, over the span of 40 years, Victoria has personally absorbed approximately $342,000 of our parents' wealth. Aunt Margaret let out a highly audible, horrified gasp through her computer microphone. Aunt Linda slapped a hand tightly over her mouth in pure shock. And what exactly does the ledger list for your side? Rachel asked, her voice incredibly gentle. I flipped to my designated section of the papers. Exactly half of one page. A grand total of $7,400. Victoria was violently shaking her head back and forth on the screen. Those are complete fabrications. Mom would never meticulously track things like that. I wrote that ledger, Victoria. Every single head in the room instantly snapped toward the wheelchair. My mother's voice was incredibly thin, heavily trembling with emotion, but undeniably clear. I actively wrote down absolutely all of it. Every single penny. Every single date. My mother slowly lifted her head and stared directly at the television monitor, where Victoria's face had drained of all human color. It is all 100% true. My father was staring blankly at the photocopies on the table. He was trying to decipher an alien language. Maybe he honestly was seeing the grim reality for the very first time. Maybe he had spent 40 years letting my mother quietly handle the administrative details while he successfully brainwashed himself into believing he was a fair and equitable parent. But the profound, crushing shame washing over his face confirmed that he could no longer hide behind his delusions. Nobody in the room could. This is totally insane. Victoria's pitch had reached a frantic, desperate level. You maintained a literal ledger. Like we were corporate accounts waiting to be audited. My mother physically flinched at the attack, but refused to look away from the camera. That cash was intended for genuine emergencies. Victoria desperately tried to spin the narrative. It was funding for major life opportunities. You literally never needed financial help, Tori. You were always perfectly fine surviving on your own. I was only fine because I had absolutely no other choice but to be fine. I fired back. You actively chose to live that boring life. Did I? I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, my voice dangerously low and fully controlled. Or was that life systematically chosen for me by people who refused to invest in my potential? Rachel Smith was furiously scribbling notes onto her legal pad, her pen gliding across the paper. Okay, let's try to stay completely focused on the immediate care plan. She attempted to intervene. No, Victoria screamed, totally cutting the social worker off. I demand to know what Tori actually thinks she is accomplishing here. Is she trying to prove that she is the ultimate martyr? The perfect little saint who suffered in noble silence. I am not attempting to prove a single thing, Victoria. I am simply presenting objective truth. The objective truth is that I possessed vastly more potential than you. I had massive opportunities. That is exactly why they chose to invest their capital into my future. And exactly how did those massive investments pan out for them, Victoria? I asked coldly. She instantly froze. You completely liquidated the house, I stated, letting the facts do the bleeding. The exact property they purchased for you. You lost the entire asset. I did not lose a damn thing. I made a highly strategic financial pivot. You made a highly toxic decision that ultimately left you drowning in $89,000 of high-interest credit card debt. Brandon violently shifted his weight back and forth behind Victoria, looking like he wanted to jump out a window. Aunt Linda actively averted her eyes from her webcam, too deeply embarrassed to even watch the carnage. You have absolutely no right to publicly expose my... Victoria stuttered, completely losing her footing. I have absolutely every right in the world. I shot back. You are sitting in a meeting actively telling this family that you cannot afford to contribute a single dime to keep the people who raised you alive. I am simply providing the context as to why you are broke. I didn't need to scream. The facts were loud enough. $342,000 handed to you on a silver platter, and you cannot scrape together $200 a month to help them. Victoria's perfectly lined eyes began to glisten with panicked tears. For one brief second, her arrogant mask slipped, and she looked incredibly young and utterly lost. Are you just trying to publicly humiliate me? No. I slowly shook my head. I am just trying to tell the actual truth. For the very first time in my 30 years of existence, I am just demanding the truth be spoken out loud. The conference room descended into a heavy, agonizing silence. My mother was quietly sobbing into a tissue in her wheelchair. And my father couldn't bring himself to look at a single person in the room. He just stared at his lap. Rachel Smith gently placed her pen down onto the table. I think it is crucial that we take a brief pause to emotionally acknowledge what has just been revealed here. There is obviously a highly significant, deeply painful family history that is currently impacting this care discussion. I nodded in agreement. I am not here to maliciously punish anyone in this room. I am simply demanding that we operate on fairness. Fair, Victoria bitterly muttered into her microphone. Yes, fair, I replied, physically turning my chair to address the entire room. Let me clearly outline exactly what I bring to the table. I rattled off my assets with zero ego, just cold, hard facts. Marcus and I fully own our primary residence. We aggressively paid off the mortgage in full last year. We possess robust retirement portfolios that we have actively built over 25 years of hard labor. I have 15 years of specialized clinical experience in geriatric nursing. I deeply understand the medical system. I know how to evaluate the facilities. I know exactly what mom and dad physically require to survive. I took a long, deep breath. I am highly capable of helping. I possess the clinical skills, the financial resources, and quite frankly, the moral heart to do it. But I absolutely refuse to execute this care plan while being treated as the invisible, disposable backup option. Aunt Margaret unmuted her microphone, her voice thick and choked with heavy emotion. Tori, we honestly had absolutely no idea the disparity was this severe. Nobody ever asked the right questions. Her words weren't defensive, they were just a tragic admission of reality. My father slowly cleared his throat. When he finally forced himself to speak, his vocal cords sounded rough and entirely broken. We truly thought we were doing what was best for the family. Victoria. Victoria just always seemed to desperately need more help than you did. She only demanded more help because you fundamentally taught her that she was entitled to receive more. I countered. I stared directly at my father, forcing him to hold my gaze. And you systematically taught me to expect absolutely nothing. So, I figured out how to build an entire life by myself. My mother reached across the space between their chairs and desperately gripped my father's trembling hand. Her bottom lip was violently quivering. I am so incredibly sorry, Tori, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I thought Victoria needed the safety net. I firmly believed you would always be perfectly fine without one. I was absolutely not always fine, Mom. My voice finally cracked under the emotional weight. I just eventually learned that it was pointless to ask for help. The suffocating silence that immediately followed felt like a dam finally bursting wide open. And in the wake of that destruction, something fundamental in our dynamic permanently shifted. I love both of you very much, I said quietly, wiping my eyes. But unconditionally loving you does not mean I am legally required to permanently erase my own existence. Rachel Smith leaned forward, utilizing her incredibly soothing, professional tone to wrangle the room back together. I think it is glaringly obvious that there is a massive amount of historical trauma to unpack here. However, my immediate legal responsibility is to guarantee that Mr. and Mrs. Young have a safe, viable discharge strategy. She pulled out a freshly printed packet and placed it on the table. Let me systematically walk everyone through the reality of our options. Option 1. The family provides direct, in-home care. That legally mandates that a competent adult is physically present 24/7 to manage complex pharmaceuticals, prepare specialized meals, and handle all physical mobility. She slowly scanned the room. Absolutely nobody raised a hand to volunteer. Option 2. Transitioning into a specialized assisted living facility. Given their specific dual care requirements, you are staring at a monthly invoice ranging between $6,000 and $10,000. My father sucked in a sharp, horrified breath of air. Option 3. Contracting professional in-home nursing staff. That averages between $4,000 and $8,000 monthly, highly dependent on the required hourly coverage. Rachel turned her compassionate gaze toward me. And what is the exact status of their liquid savings? Approximately $130,000, I stated firmly. Okay. So, options 2 or 3 would be financially sustainable for roughly 12 to 18 months maximum. Once those assets are depleted, a highly complex Medicaid application process would need to be initiated. That sounds incredibly complicated, Victoria chimed back in, her voice significantly smaller and less arrogant than before. What about the physical house they currently reside in? Could that asset potentially be liquidated? My father looked at the television screen like Victoria had just slapped him across the face. You want us to sell our family home? I am merely inquiring about the financial options. That house is their ultimate safety net, I interjected, shutting her down. It is their sanctuary of 45 years. It is literally the physical structure where they raised us. I am fully aware of what the house represents, Tori. Then you should be fully aware that it is not your personal ATM to drain. Victoria's jaw locked into a furious scowl. You are just actively trying to paint me as the villain of this story. I am not painting you as anything. I am simply begging you to show up and act like an adult. Up on the monitor, Victoria violently opened her mouth to launch a counterattack. And then, she unleashed a sentence that completely altered the trajectory of the entire meeting. Okay, I really need to hit the pause button right here. Because what Victoria decided to scream next. I honestly still cannot fathom that she had the audacity to say it on a recorded hospital line in front of the extended family. Before I drop this final bomb, I have a massive question for you all. Who do you genuinely believe should bear the primary responsibility for caring for aging, sick parents? The golden child who received hundreds of thousands in handouts, or the self-sufficient child who was totally ignored? Please tell me your honest thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. Now, brace yourselves, because here is exactly how she tried to destroy me. You know what? Victoria's voice was physically shaking with desperate rage. Fine. You really want to play this toxic game, Tori. Let's play it. She leaned her face aggressively into the webcam, her cheeks flushed bright red. Mom, Dad, were you guys aware that Tori actively boycotted Thanksgiving dinner last year? Did you know she completely abandoned us on Christmas Eve? She has been maliciously pulling away and isolating herself from this family for years. She barely picks up the phone. She refuses to visit the house. My father deeply frowned in confusion. My mother looked entirely bewildered in her wheelchair. That is absolutely not, I started to defend myself. Let me finish. Victoria screamed, holding her palm up to the camera lens. She is sitting in that room acting like she is the ultimate devoted, holy daughter. But where the hell was she for the major holidays? Where was she when I was busting my ass hosting, cooking massive meals, and trying to make everything magical and perfect for the family? I sat back in my chair and patiently waited until she completely ran out of oxygen. Then I spoke with lethal, icy calmness. I didn't attend those holidays because I was never invited to them. That is totally ridiculous. I hosted both of those events at my house, and I never received a single phone call, text message, or invitation from you. I logically assumed my presence was entirely unwanted. Victoria sputtered wildly into the microphone. Of course you were welcome. You just chose to. Actually, Aunt Margaret suddenly interrupted, her face contorting with deep trouble on the video feed. I distinctly remember inquiring about Tori's whereabouts during Thanksgiving dinner. Victoria, you explicitly told the entire dining room that Tori was off doing her own thing this year. The blood instantly vanished from Victoria's face. You are completely misremembering the conversation, Aunt Margaret. I am absolutely not misremembering. Aunt Margaret's voice grew incredibly firm. I specifically asked why she was missing. I stated that I thought it was highly unusual that Tori wasn't present for the meal. My mother slowly cranked her neck to look up at the television monitor. You specifically told me that Tori was swamped with hospital shifts, she whispered to Victoria. You swore to me she had to work overtime. She probably did. Victoria scrambled, panicking. I was absolutely not working. I kept my voice dead level. I was sitting alone in my house, staring at my phone, waiting for a holiday invitation that never arrived. The conference room plunged into a suffocating, radioactive silence. Even Rachel Smith had completely stopped taking notes on her clipboard. Victoria had launched a desperate, tactical strike to paint me as the cold, abandoning daughter. Instead, she had miraculously publicly exposed herself as the cruel architect who had actively engineered my isolation from the family. I didn't even have to hurl an accusation at her. She had spectacularly detonated her own character in front of everyone. Victoria's voice completely broke, her arrogant facade crumbling into dust. That is not how I remember the events playing out. It is exactly how I remember it playing out, Aunt Margaret stated with a brutal, quiet finality. It is how I remember it too, I added softly. I slowly stood up from my chair. I didn't do it to be theatrical or intimidating. I just desperately needed to stretch my spine and physically feel my own 2 feet planted firmly on the hospital floor. Here is exactly what I am willing to commit to, I announced to the room. Every single pair of eyes was locked onto me. Victoria trembling on the television screen, my shattered parents in their chairs, Rachel gripping her clipboard, and Marcus sitting like a mountain of quiet support right beside me. Number 1, I stated clearly. I will personally oversee and coordinate all of Mom and Dad's medical care transitions. I possess the clinical expertise. I intimately know how the system operates. I am willing to shoulder that logistical burden. Rachel nodded enthusiastically, furiously scribbling the commitment onto her pad. Number 2. Marcus and I will personally contribute $1,500 every single month to aggressively subsidize their facility costs. My father's head snapped up in pure shock. That was a massive chunk of real, tangible capital. Money I was offering entirely out of the goodness of my own heart, despite everything they had done to me. Number 3. I will physically visit the facility twice a week. I will aggressively manage their pharmaceutical prescriptions, and I will act as the primary emergency contact for all critical medical decisions. I let those massive concessions settle into the room. But I continued, letting the heavy word hang in the air like an executioner's axe. I will absolutely not resign from my career. I will absolutely not move them into my personal residence. And I will absolutely not pretend that this dynamic is fair or justify I'm the only child actively contributing. I turned my body and locked eyes directly with the webcam lens. Victoria. That explicitly means you are required to find a way to help our parents. Even if you can only scrounge up $200 a month. Even if you only manage to visit the facility twice a calendar year. You are mandated to step up and show up. I physically can't. She whimpered. You somehow managed to blow $89,000 on high-interest credit cards. You can absolutely figure out a way to sacrifice $200 a month to keep your parents off the street. That is completely unfair. Absolutely nothing in this room is fair, Victoria. But this is the grim reality we are currently operating in. Rachel Smith tactfully jumped back into the fray. These sound like incredibly reasonable, generous starting points to establish a viable care plan. Victoria, are you willing to verbally commit to any baseline level of financial contribution today? The heavy silence stretched to its absolute breaking point. I watched Brandon lean over and frantically whisper something into Victoria's ear. She violently shook her head, fighting back tears, and then let out a massive, defeated sigh. I will thoroughly review my finances and see what I can scrape together. I am not demanding a perfectly equal split, I told her firmly. I am just demanding something. Anything. Because zero contribution is no longer an acceptable answer. Victoria didn't offer a rebuttal. But crucially, she didn't try to argue with me either. For the very first time in our 30 years of sisterhood, she had completely run out of ammunition. My father was the first person in the room to emotionally break. We honestly didn't know. His voice was a raspy, barely audible whisper. We genuinely didn't comprehend that the scale was this unbalanced. I stared down at this frail, broken man who had spent my entire childhood actively looking right through me. Yes, you did, Dad. Mom sat down and meticulously wrote it all out in permanent ink. My mother's frail shoulders were violently shaking in her wheelchair. Hot tears cascaded down her cheeks, carving deep, messy tracks through her makeup. I am so incredibly sorry. The words were choked out through heavy sobs. I honestly thought. I convinced myself that Victoria desperately needed the money more. She was constantly struggling. She was constantly begging for bailouts. And you were always so remarkably steady, Tori. You were so undeniably capable of surviving. So you decided to hand her your entire kingdom, and you left me completely isolated to build a life out of scraps? I just thought you were infinitely stronger than her, she wailed. I only had to be stronger because you completely stripped me of the luxury of being weak. You left me with absolutely no other choice. The agonizing silence that followed my outburst was practically unbearable. My father aimlessly stared down at his own trembling hands. My mother wept openly into her gown. Up on the monitor, Victoria had gone completely mute, not out of tactical strategy, but from something that looked remarkably similar to profound, catatonic shock. So, is this it? Victoria finally whispered into her microphone, her voice sounding tiny and hollow. I am just permanently branded as the ultimate villain of the family now? The evil, greedy daughter. I slowly shook my head at the screen. You are not an evil villain, Victoria. You are my older sister. But you have spent the last 30 years of your life being violently shielded from the concept of consequences. This is simply what accountability feels like. Aunt Linda unmuted her microphone, her voice incredibly soft and hesitant. Victoria, sweetheart. I really think maybe Tori has a very valid point here. I do not need you to psychoanalyze her right now. Brandon's voice suddenly boomed through the speakers. He sounded quiet, but deeply furious. "Victoria, we are going to log off and discuss this extensively offline." Victoria immediately averted her eyes from the webcam lens, her jaw locked in pure humiliation. My mother shakily reached her arm across the space and desperately grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were freezing cold and felt as fragile as hollow bird bones. "Please forgive me, Tori," she begged, looking up at me with shattered eyes. "Please." I stared down at the woman who had obsessively counted every single dollar for 40 years, but somehow never managed to calculate the devastating emotional toll it extracted from my soul. "I unconditionally love you, Mom." My voice finally cracked under the pressure. "I just desperately needed you to look at me and see me." She squeezed my wrist with whatever tiny ounce of strength she had left, vigorously nodding her head. "I see you," she whispered through her tears. "I finally see you now." The video call abruptly terminated. Victoria's digital box vanished from the television screen without a single goodbye. The conference room felt incredibly hollow afterward, like it had been violently gutted by the sheer magnitude of the explosive truths that had been unleashed. Rachel Smith efficiently gathered her scattered paperwork, her professional mask perfectly glued back into place. "I will personally draft and email everyone a comprehensive summary of today's resolutions," Rachel announced, standing up. "The agreed-upon financial contributions, the tentative medical care strategies, and all immediate next steps." She paused right at the heavy wooden door, turning back to look directly at me. "Family intervention meetings are notoriously agonizing, but brutally honest ones almost always yield the safest, most sustainable outcomes." She offered a tiny, respectful nod. "You navigated this incredibly well, Mrs. Young." I just nodded back. I certainly didn't feel like I had successfully navigated anything. I felt like I had been dragged backwards over broken glass. Dr. Morrison silently shook my father's trembling hand and exited the room. The remaining Zoom boxes featuring my stunned aunts winked out one by one. Aunt Margaret offered a tiny, supportive wave before disconnecting. Aunt Linda logged off with visible tears streaming down her face. And then, it was just the four of us left in the sterile room. My shattered parents, Marcus, and me. My father remained frozen in his chair like a statue. He hadn't uttered a single syllable since his pathetic attempt at a justification. "Harold," my mother pleaded gently from her wheelchair. "Please, say something to her." He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot and brimming with unshed tears. "I honestly do not know what words to say right now." "You don't have to force out any words today, Dad," I replied softly. Marcus quietly stood up and helped me gather my tote bag and jacket. As we began the long walk down the hospital corridor toward the exit doors, my cell phone violently buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Aunt Linda. *, I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea the financial abuse was this severe. Your father and I are going to have a very long, very painful conversation tonight. I am so incredibly proud of you, Tori. *. A second later, another text popped up. This one from Aunt Margaret. *, Victoria is obviously humiliated and throwing a tantrum, but she desperately needed to hear those hard truths. Frankly, we all did. In my entire 30 years of existence, absolutely nobody in my extended family had ever uttered the words, "I am proud of you." Marcus firmly wrapped his heavy arm around my shoulders as we stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the hospital parking lot. "You didn't lose your temper or scream a single time in there," he said, sounding deeply impressed. "I didn't need to scream," I sighed, leaning my exhausted body into a solid frame. The objective truth was devastating enough on its own. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew deep in my bones that this war wasn't officially over. The true, agonizing aftermath of the explosion was only just beginning. Exactly 1 week following the hospital showdown, the logistical puzzle pieces slowly started clicking into place. My mother was officially transferred into a highly rated, inpatient physical rehabilitation facility located just 20 minutes from my house. Her hip fracture was knitting back together, and the team of physical therapists were expressing cautious, measured optimism about her mobility. My father temporarily relocated into Aunt Linda's house. Her property featured an accessible ground-floor guest suite and she absolutely insisted on hosting him. Harold desperately needs some quiet time to deeply reflect on his life choices, she told me over a private phone call. And quite honestly, so do I. I dedicated dozens of grueling hours coordinating with my colleague Diane, obsessively touring facilities, and aggressively comparing monthly invoices. We miraculously managed to secure a spot in a beautiful assisted living community that could safely accommodate both of my parents in the same suite. Featuring a specialized memory care wing, they could seamlessly transition into if my father's cognitive decline rapidly accelerated. The grand total for the facility? $7,200 every single month. I had already legally committed to subsidizing $1,500 of that invoice. My parents' remaining liquid savings could safely cover $4,500 a month without immediately risking bankruptcy. That left exactly a $1,200 monthly deficit. On Thursday evening, my father called my cell phone. "I had a very long conversation with your sister this morning," he said, his voice sounding incredibly weary. "She has officially agreed to wire the remaining funds every month. $1,200. He paused, clearing his throat. She was extremely defensive and refused to stay on the line for long, but she legally committed to the amount. $1,200. It was a pathetic drop in the bucket compared to the $342,000 empire she had extracted from them, but it was exactly $1,200 more than I ever expected to see. "And what about physical visits?" I asked. She said she would try her absolute best to make the drive out. Trying, it wasn't an ironclad promise. It certainly wasn't an apology. But it was something. "Dad," I gripped the phone tight, bracing myself for his answer. "I desperately need to know something. Did you genuinely, honestly not realize how profoundly unequal your financial distribution was?" A heavy, agonizing silence blanketed the phone line. I actively forced myself to believe the situations were entirely different, he finally confessed, his voice breaking. "Victoria was presented with massive, expensive opportunities. You already had everything figured out." He stopped talking, took a shaky breath, and started over. "I actively chose not to look at you, Tori. For all those decades, I forcefully blinded myself to your reality." "Why would you do that?" "Because," he sobbed quietly into the receiver, "if I actually allowed myself to see the pain I was causing you, I would have to face the monster I had become. And I was far too cowardly to face it. Are you finally ready to face it today?" His voice violently cracked into a million pieces. "I am so sorry, Tori. I am so incredibly, deeply sorry." For simple words. They were delivered 30 years too late, but they were the absolute first genuine, undefensive words of remorse the man had ever offered me. Exactly 2 weeks after the conference room bloodbath, my phone screen illuminated with a highly unexpected notification. The caller ID simply read, "Victoria." I sat on my couch and stared at her name glowing on the glass for a very long moment before I finally summoned the courage to tap open the text message. "I am officially initiating the first $1,200 bank transfer today," the message read. Asterisk, Brandon helped me sit down and formally structure an aggressive payment plan to start managing my horrific credit card debt. I am really going to try and make this work. Asterisk. I read the small block of text 3 times to ensure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I called Marcus into the kitchen. "What is your honest read on this?" I asked, handing him the illuminated screen. He read the message, his facial expression remaining perfectly neutral. "What do you genuinely want to reply to her?" "I want to desperately believe that she is actually trying." "Then you should type exactly that." I grabbed the phone back, slowly typing, deleting, and frantically rewriting my response twice before finally landing on something raw and authentic. Asterisk, "Thank you for doing this, Victoria. That genuinely means a lot to me and to them. I know this transition is not easy." Asterisk. Her response pinged back almost instantaneously. Asterisk, "It is absolute hell. But you were 100% right in that meeting. I cannot keep running away from reality forever." Asterisk. I held my breath and waited. The 3 gray typing bubbles appeared on the screen, vanished, and then rapidly appeared again. Asterisk, I honestly have no idea how to be a different, responsible person. but I am genuinely trying to figure it out. Asterisk. There was no sweeping, tearful apology. There might never be one for as long as we both live. But this was raw, unfiltered acknowledgement. And right now, true acknowledgement was vastly more valuable to me than a fake apology. I typed back, asterisk, maybe, if you feel up to it, we can schedule a day to visit Mom at the rehab center together next month. Asterisk. The agonizing pause before her next message arrived stretched on for so long I assumed she had thrown her phone into a river. Asterisk, maybe. Please just let me figure some personal things out on my end first. Asterisk. It wasn't a magical, cinematic reconciliation. It wasn't total, absolving forgiveness. It was simply two estranged adult sisters desperately trying to invent a brand new vocabulary after spending 30 years violently speaking two entirely different languages. Marcus peered over my shoulder, reading the final exchange. That looks like real progress to me. Or maybe she is just completely exhausted from fighting the truth. It could honestly be a combination of both. I locked my phone screen and set it down on the granite counter. I looked out the kitchen window. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, bleeding gorgeous streaks of fiery orange and soft pink into the deepening purple sky. Victoria might never undergo a miraculous personality transplant. She might never utter the words, "I am sorry." But she had finally shown up to the financial battlefield, at least. And for right now, that was light years more than I had received in 30 years. It was a fragile, messy beginning. But it was a beginning. Exactly 1 month after the explosive hospital meeting, I made the drive to visit my mother entirely alone. She had officially been transitioned into the permanent assisted living facility. Her new reality was a quiet, sterile room featuring a large window that overlooked a manicured courtyard garden. Her fractured hip was healing remarkably well. Some afternoons, her cognitive mind was as sharp as a tack. On others, she aimlessly drifted through fog. Today happened to be a remarkably sharp day. I walked into her room and found her sitting quietly in a recliner by the window, peacefully observing a flock of sparrows fighting over a bird feeder. When she heard my footsteps, she slowly turned her head and offered a warm smile. "Tori, please, come sit with me for a while." I pulled a padded visitor's chair close to her recliner and gently took her fragile hand in mine. We sat in total silence for a very long time. It wasn't the suffocating, toxic silence of my childhood. It was a heavy, full silence, stuffed to the brim with absolutely everything we had screamed in that conference room and everything we had left unsaid. Your father brought the leather notebook to the facility and showed it to me again last night, she finally whispered, her eyes tracking a bird outside the glass. All of my obsessive, calculated numbers. I know, Mom. I always fundamentally knew the columns were obscenely unequal. I knew exactly what I was documenting every single time I picked up that pen. She slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes more violently clear and focused than I had seen them in months. I just aggressively refused to let my own brain process what the math actually meant. Why couldn't you process it? She fell quiet for a long moment, desperately trying to gather her fragmented thoughts. Victoria was exactly like a roaring fire. She was blindingly bright, incredibly demanding, and constantly, aggressively hungry for fuel. I was so utterly terrified that if I stopped feeding her cash and attention, she would simply burn out and completely disappear from my life. She weakly squeezed my fingers. And you were exactly like water. You were so incredibly steady, so deeply patient and resilient. I legitimately thought you would always survive, no matter what. I was absolutely not always okay, Mom. I know you realize that now. Her voice dropped to a shattered, agonizing whisper. I know. Then why didn't you ever just ask me if I was drowning? Because a hot tear escaped her eye and rolled down her wrinkled cheek, it was infinitely easier to blindly believe that you didn't require my help. Because actively admitting that you desperately needed me would mean forcefully admitting that I had spectacularly failed you as a mother. More tears rapidly gathered in her eyes, spilling over her lashes. And I had spectacularly failed you. I was just far too much of a coward to say it out loud. I didn't lie to her and say it was okay. It absolutely wasn't okay. But I leaned forward in my chair and gently kissed her forehead. I love you so much, Mom. I love you too, Tori, she wept, reaching up with her frail, trembling hands to cup my face. Please, please forgive me. I am so desperately trying to be better. I know you are, I replied with absolute honesty. And I am really trying to forgive you. It was the absolute maximum amount of grace I was capable of offering her in that exact moment. And for right now, it was enough to keep us both breathing. 6 months evaporated into the rearview mirror. My life didn't magically transform into a flawless, cinematic paradise. But it finally became manageable. And sometimes, manageable is the ultimate victory. My parents officially settled into the rhythm of the assisted living community, sharing a modest but comfortable 2-bedroom suite. My mother's shattered hip fully healed, allowing her to utilize a walker. My father's cognitive dementia progressed, but thankfully at a very slow crawl. He experienced deeply confusing, frustrating bad days, but the good days still outnumbered them. They were surrounded by round-the-clock nursing staff, daily social activities, and a community of peers they could actually relate to. Victoria continued to wire her money on the first of every single month. Not a single time did her payment bounce or arrive late. She physically drove down to visit our parents exactly twice during those 6 months. They were incredibly short, painfully awkward, and heavily guarded visits, but the fact remained, she actually showed up. She hasn't apologized to me. I officially stopped holding my breath waiting for it to happen. Our dynamic is definitely not warm or fuzzy. We do not text each other funny memes or call just to chat about our weekends. But on the rare occasions that we are forced to speak, the tone is civil, heavily guarded, and occasionally, it borders on kind. We are slowly, awkwardly trying to learn how to exist as sisters again, albeit within a highly restricted, heavily boundaried framework. My father explicitly asked to speak with me alone one breezy Tuesday afternoon. We sat side by side on a wooden bench in the facility's manicured courtyard, silently watching massive, fluffy white clouds drift lazily across the bright blue sky. I have been doing a massive amount of agonizing reflection lately, he started, his speech much slower than it used to be. Thinking intensely about the financial choices I made, and specifically why I made them. I honestly convinced myself that pouring my wealth into Victoria was the ultimate investment in the entire family's long-term future. She possessed the fancy business degree. She possessed the ruthless ambition. I genuinely believed she would climb the corporate ladder, make an absolute fortune, and eventually take care of all of us in our old age. He slowly shook his head, a bitter, sad smile touching his lips. I idiotically dumped my entire life savings into a single, volatile stock, and I completely abandoned my other asset with absolutely nothing. That is a highly interesting corporate metaphor, Dad. He let out a dry, rattling chuckle. It was actually your mother's phrasing. Her mind is vastly sharper than she pretends it is. We sat together in a surprisingly comfortable silence for several minutes, just listening to the wind rustle through the courtyard trees. You definitively turned out to be the vastly superior investment, Tori, he murmured quietly, refusing to break eye contact with the clouds. I was just far too incredibly blind and arrogant to see your value. It wasn't a flawless, Hallmark movie apology, but it was raw, unfiltered honesty. And coming from my father, raw honesty was a rare enough commodity that it felt almost exactly like grace. Thanks, Dad. He nodded slowly. We went back to watching the clouds roll by. I realized then that some deep, fundamental fractures can never be perfectly glued back together, but new, beautiful things can still manage to grow in the cracks. Late that summer, on a remarkably warm and perfect evening, Marcus and I were lounging on our back porch, silently watching dozens of glowing fireflies rhythmically blink across our overgrown lawn. The house was blissfully quiet. Our adult daughter had FaceTimed us earlier in the afternoon. She was absolutely thriving at her new corporate job 3 time zones away. Marcus had spent the evening grilling steaks, and I had whipped up a massive batch of my mother's famous potato salad recipe. You possess a totally different energy lately, you know that? Marcus observed after a long stretch of comfortable silence. Is it a good different, or a terrifyingly bad different? It's lighter. He reached across the patio table and gently enveloped my hand in his. It looks exactly like you finally put down a massive, crushing boulder you've been carrying for decades. I sat back and really pondered that observation. For 30 agonizing years, I had hauled around a massive, suffocating question. Why on earth am I simply not enough for them? I finally realized I hadn't asked myself that toxic question in months. It wasn't because I had miraculously discovered a satisfying answer, but simply because the question itself had entirely lost its power over me. I think I finally just gave up trying to prove my worth to people, I said, staring out at the glowing bugs. Well, it is about damn time, he laughed. It was a deep, rich, genuine laugh that startled a genuine smile out of my own face. We sat together in the warm, enveloping silence. The fireflies aimlessly drifted through the humid air. The brilliant summer stars began popping into existence one by one across the black canopy of the sky. Marcus? Yeah, thank you so incredibly much for never, ever making me feel like I was required to prove my inherent value to you. He squeezed my fingers tightly. You never had to prove a single thing to me, Tori. I have always known exactly the caliber of woman you are. Even during the dark years when you totally forgot, I always remembered. I leaned my exhausted head onto his broad shoulder. This incredible, steadfast man had loved me quietly and fiercely for 25 years. He had never once demanded that I shrink myself to make him feel larger. He had held my shaking hand through terrifying hospital ultimatums, devastating family financial revelations, and the grueling, messy emotional fallout that followed. He had taught me the exact profound lesson my biological parents never managed to grasp, that being unconditionally loved should never, ever feel like an exhausting, high-stakes audition. I am so unbelievably grateful, I whispered into the night air. For all of this. For us. Me too, kiddo. We didn't need to exchange another syllable. The flashing fireflies communicated everything we needed to say. They were just tiny, insignificant lights fighting against the overwhelming darkness, incredibly steady, deeply persistent. Just like water, my mother had tearfully confessed. Steady and patient. Perhaps being exactly like water wasn't such a tragic curse to bear after all. Looking back on this entire nightmare now, I can finally see the profound lessons I extracted from the wreckage. It required 30 years of suffocating silence and one explosive hospital conference room to fully comprehend these universal truths. First, establishing ironclad boundaries is absolutely not an act of malicious rejection. It is an act of basic self-preservation. I literally wasted decades of my life screaming yes to toxic people who never once bothered to ask me what I actually needed to survive. Finally learning how to look my family in the eye and say, no, absolutely not like this, wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of profound, life-saving clarity. Second, the unvarnished truth might burn like acid in the immediate moment, but maintaining a toxic silence will slowly rot your soul for a lifetime. I could have easily shoved that leather notebook back into the filing cabinet. I could have swallowed my fiery words at that hospital table, just like I had swallowed my pride for 30 years. But every single time I chose to remain quiet, I actively amputated a vital piece of my own identity. Finding the courage to speak up was the most terrifying thing I have ever done. But it was also the exact key that finally unlocked my prison cell. Finally, you absolutely do not require an apology from your abusers to initiate your own healing process. Victoria hasn't apologized for bankrupting my parents. She honestly may never apologize for it. For a very long time, I falsely believed I desperately required those specific words to finally move forward with my life. But I was entirely wrong. Her lack of an apology is a burden entirely on her own conscience. My personal healing is exclusively about reclaiming my own life. Those two concepts do not have to be intertwined. I operate under a brand new set of rules now. The boundaries are shockingly uncomplicated. I will absolutely step up and help my family survive, but I will never again set myself on fire just to keep them warm. I will speak the objective truth, even when it makes every single person in the room deeply uncomfortable. And I will absolutely never again accept being treated as an invisible ghost just to secure a fake, pathetic sense of acceptance. Victoria may never undergo a miraculous personality shift. My elderly parents may not survive long enough to perfectly repair the massive psychological damage they inflicted. But the most important variable has permanently changed. I have changed. I can finally look in the mirror and see myself clearly. I intimately know my own astronomical worth, not because a family member finally decided to acknowledge it, but because I finally stopped waiting around for their permission to claim it. The reliable one, my father had labeled me in that hospital room. Asterisk, the practical one. The boring daughter who simply puts her head down and never complains. Asterisk, he originally deployed those words as a patronizing description of a lesser being, someone who didn't warrant financial attention or emotional investment. But I finally know the undisputed truth now. Being reliable is absolutely not a pathetic consolation prize handed to the loser. It is an absolute, undeniable superpower. And I have finally learned exactly how to wield it. If you have made it this deeply into the video, if you are still sitting here listening to my story, I desperately need to tell you something important. You do not have to wait 30 agonizing years to be seen. I did. I wasted decades waiting for my parents to miraculously notice my achievements, to value my presence, to actively choose me the exact same way they effortlessly chose my sister. I sat around waiting for a grand validation that was never going to arrive, until the exact second I stopped waiting and started speaking my truth. If you see your own reflection in my painful story, if you are the chronically overlooked child, the emergency backup plan, the kid who was automatically assumed to be fine simply because nobody ever bothered to check your pulse, please, listen to me. You possess the absolute right to speak up. You possess the right to erect massive, impenetrable boundaries. You have the total authority to demand basic fairness without ever needing to demand toxic revenge. And you absolutely do not need their tearful apology to start healing your own soul. Their lack of an apology is a reflection of their own brokenness. Your healing journey is entirely about you. Years ago, my father casually asked me why I didn't pursue a highly lucrative career as a medical doctor, exactly like he had initially envisioned Victoria doing. I looked him dead in the eye and told him, because I actively chose to dedicate my life to helping people who actually have time left, instead of desperately trying to impress people who never had any time for me. He didn't have a clever comeback for that reality check back then. But after the dust finally settled from the explosive hospital meeting, after the ugly truth was dragged into the light, and after 6 brutal months of emotional rebuilding, he finally told me something drastically different. I should have been immensely proud of you this entire time, he whispered to me in the courtyard. I should have actively seen exactly who you were. And then, he simply sat back and listened to me. He really, truly listened for the very first time in his life. That is exactly what 47 seconds of deafening silence eventually transformed into. It became a dialogue. A highly imperfect, deeply messy conversation, but a beautiful beginning nonetheless. I spent decades falsely believing my life story was a tragedy about being invisible. Now, I understand it as a triumphant epic about finally becoming visible. To myself, first and foremost. And to absolutely everyone else second. 47 seconds of agonizing silence completely revolutionized my entire existence. What exactly will your ultimate moment of truth sound like? When will you finally stop waiting in the shadows and start speaking your reality into existence? That answer is entirely yours to discover. And I genuinely hope you find the courage to discover it soon. Thank you so incredibly much for staying with me through this entire, exhausting journey. If any specific part of my experience resonated with your soul, or if you have ever felt completely unseen, totally overlooked, or manipulated into being the family's ultimate backup plan, please drop down and share your personal experience in the comments section below. I promise you, I read every single one of them. And if my story offered you any shred of hope or validation today, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to check out the recommended video linked in the description box. It is another incredibly powerful story about a woman standing her ground when the entire world expected her to remain quiet. Always remember, you deserve to be vastly more than someone's convenient, reliable backup option. You absolutely deserve to be seen. I will see you all in the next video.